In Tehran, Iran's president is trying to draw a sharp line. Iran, he says, is ready for peace, but not for surrender. Masoud Pezeshkian, president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, has used his latest remarks to respond directly to mounting military pressure, renewed sanctions talk, and Western demands over Tehran's nuclear and missile programs. Speaking against the backdrop of recent US claims that Iran is seeking sanctions relief, and after a year marked by confrontation, including a 12-day war between Iran and Israel and US. Israeli strikes on Iranian sites, Pezeshkian is spelling out how far Iran is willing to go and where it will not move an inch. He presents two parallel messages. On one side, he frames Iran as open to dialogue, rooted in international law and multilateral frameworks. On the other, he rejects what he portrays as a familiar language of threats: abandon enrichment, halt missiles, accept permanent vulnerability, or face attack. For Quaita Pezeshkian, that equation is unacceptable, and his choice of words is carefully calibrated to sound both measured and defiant. Masoud Pezeshkian, president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, said, "Iran seeks peace, but will not bow to coercion." That line has become the anchor of his message. It is not simply rhetorical. It is tied to three strategic pillars he is now emphasizing more explicitly: sovereign rights in nuclear technology, missile deterrence, and national dignity. Pezeshkian begins by positioning Iran as a state under pressure, not a state seeking escalation. He recalls that the country's nuclear program, from Tehran's perspective, is legal, supervised, and framed as peaceful. The leadership insists Iran is not pursuing nuclear weapons and that its enrichment and research activities are tied to energy, medicine, and technological independence. That argument is not new. What's different now is how he is binding it to a broader demand for respect in security negotiations. In his remarks, Pezeshkian signals that Iran remains prepared to engage in talks, including with Western powers, so long as those talks are grounded in existing international agreements and do not require Iran to erase its core capabilities as an entry ticket. We are willing to hold talks under international frameworks, but he couples that offer with a firm rejection of ultimata that target what he calls Iran's rights: nuclear science, missile defense, and strategic deterrence. From his standpoint, the message is straightforward. Iran will talk, but it will not negotiate with a gun held to its head. The timing of these comments is crucial. In Washington, US President Donald Trump has asserted that Iran is reaching out for sanctions relief, presenting Tehran as the side under economic and political strain. Pezeshkian's answer is crafted to undercut that narrative. Yes, Iran wants sanctions lifted. Yes, it wants economic normalization, but not, he emphasizes, at the price of strategic capitulation. For Iranian officials, the memory of past negotiations is central. They point to the collapse of the 2015 nuclear deal, the so-called JCPOA, after the US withdrawal, and to years of intensified sanctions and covert and overt attacks. In this context, Pezeshkian is trying to present himself differently from both hardline maximalists and those who, critics say, placed too much faith in Western guarantees. He signals openness without naivety. Iran, he implies, has already experienced what happens when it compromises deeply and is then confronted with shifting red lines. Against that backdrop, his emphasis on deterrence is deliberate. Iranian officials insist their ballistic missiles with ranges up to roughly 2,000 kilometers are a defensive shield designed to deter the United States, Israel, and regional rivals, not a tool for nuclear aggression. Israel, the US, and several European governments see the same. Arsenal as a central threat. That clash of threat perceptions is at the heart of the standoff. Pezeshkian leans into that contradiction by highlighting what he depicts as Western double standards on arms and security. They supply arms to Israel while they tell us not to have missiles for defense. For his domestic audience, that line speaks directly to anger over US and European support for Israel during regional conflicts. For external listeners, it is an attempt to reframe Iran not as an outlier, but as a state demanding the same right to self-defense claimed by others. Beneath the rhetoric lies a larger strategic reset underway in Tehran. Since taking office, Pezeshkian has positioned himself as a president who wants to reduce isolation, reopen channels to Europe and regional neighbours, and manage tensions with Washington more pragmatically without challenging the authority of Iran's supreme leader or the core security doctrine of the state. Reports of his earlier calls for renewed nuclear diplomacy and his outreach in multilateral forums have helped construct an image of a leader who believes engagement can coexist with resistance. But recent events have constrained that space. The June conflict between Iran and Israel, accompanied by US strikes on Iranian missile and nuclear-related facilities, hardened views inside the Iranian establishment. Pezeshkian's subsequent pledge that Iran would rebuild damaged nuclear infrastructure with greater strength was a clear signal that his government would not treat those strikes as a reason to retreat from nuclear capabilities it defines as peaceful but strategic. His latest peace but no coercion line sits squarely in that trajectory. Iran is signaling it will not escalate by choice, but it also will not accept a security architecture in which it alone is disarmed or permanently vulnerable. The president's remarks also need to be read against a worsening internal landscape. In parallel with his foreign policy messaging, Pezeshkian has warned of an extremely critical water and energy crisis that could, in a worst-case scenario, force rationing and even partial evacuation of Tehran if rains fail to arrive. Those warnings underline that Iran's leadership is juggling multiple emergencies: sanctions-driven economic strain, environmental collapse, public frustration, and the constant risk of military confrontation. When Pezeshkian insists that Iran will not bow to coercion, he is also speaking to Iranians who fear that external pressure is deepening internal hardship. Masoud Pezeshkian, president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, said, "We want to live in this world in peace and security, but not be humiliated." That sentence is aimed inward as much as outward. It frames dignity, not just survival, as a non-negotiable principle in any future deal. Internationally, Pezeshkian's stance is likely to be interpreted in three different ways. For Iran's supporters and some non-aligned states, his remarks confirm a familiar narrative: a country willing to negotiate but refusing what it portrays as bullying. They may point to his repeated references to international frameworks as evidence that Tehran is not shutting the door on diplomacy. For many Western and regional governments, however, the message will be read as continuity rather than change. A president who refuses to discuss missiles, rejects deeper constraints on enrichment, and ties any talks to an end to threats is, in their view, narrowing the path to a broader agreement. The insistence that Iran's deterrent is non-negotiable feeds long-standing fears in Israel and elsewhere that Tehran is seeking strategic depth that could shift the regional balance of power. For domestic critics inside Iran's own system who favor a harder line, Pezeshkian's calibrated language may still sound too conciliatory. His talk of peace and international frameworks risks being framed by them as a concessionary tone, even when his red lines mirror theirs. That tension leaves him walking a narrow corridor. He must reassure the security establishment that he is not weakening Iran's hand, while convincing external actors that Iran's leadership is not closing itself off from diplomacy. The core of his argument is built on a conditional offer. De-escalation is possible, but only on terms Iran considers respectful and reciprocal. In practical terms, this suggests several things for the period ahead. Tehran is likely to keep signaling openness to structured talks, especially those involving major powers or regional formats, where it can invoke previous agreements and international law. It will resist any initiative framed as disarm to be spared, particularly on the missile front, where Pezeshkian and other officials argue that regional realities from US bases to Israeli capabilities justify a strong deterrent. It will use public messaging like this speech to counter claims that sanctions and strikes are forcing Iran into quiet capitulation. Instead, the leadership will present endurance and adaptation as proof that pressure has limits. And yet, the speech is also a subtle test. By stressing readiness for talks within recognized frameworks, Pezeshkian is inviting other capitals to decide whether they treat his words as an opening or dismiss them as familiar posturing. If they choose the latter, Tehran can turn back to its public and say, "We signaled peace." They answered only with more demands. If they choose the former, the conversation shifts from unilateral pressure to negotiated trade-offs over enrichment levels, monitoring, regional activity, and missile ranges. For now, Pezeshkian is not offering a roadmap so much as drawing boundaries. On one side of that line, engagement, dialogue, managed competition, the possibility of a renewed nuclear understanding, and cooperation on issues like regional stability and climate stress. On the other side, threats to bomb you, as he put it in his remarks, conditions that would strip Iran of what it defines as essential security tools, and a demand that Tehran accept a subordinate status in the regional order. His answer to that second set of options is clear and deliberately blunt. Iran seeks peace and stability, but it will never yield to coercion. That is the line he wants both Iranians and the world to remember. A country that says it is ready to negotiate, but not to kneel. For your package, you can run this as a continuous voiceover, calm, explanatory, visually layered with footage of Tehran's streets, nuclear facilities, missile parades, water-stressed reservoirs, and diplomatic meetings, letting those few highlighted quotes punctuate the narrative as Pezeshkian's own red lines in his own words.